It's got to start with the idea. And since nobody knows anything, you can't just have one idea. You have to come up with ideas. And people sometimes get all hung up on where ideas come from. How do I train myself to come up with more ideas? Where's the next big idea going to be? And those of us, of course, who do this for a living do have some tried and true techniques that we use to generate ideas. And I'll share a few of them quickly with you. I mean, one, of course, is we do look at new technologies. You know, AI, Internet of Things. My most recent startup is a big data company. We'll look at things like current trends, you know, healthcare or climate change or education, and look for business opportunities there. We'll look for business models that we can take a new business model and apply it to an old business. But there's easier ways to generate ideas. And in fact, there's one way to generate ideas that is so easy that I guarantee that every single person in this room can use this technique and come up with an idea today, potentially the idea that does transform your business. And it's remarkably simple. It is just training yourself to look for pain. You just have to learn to see the world as this imperfect place. You have to wonder what's wrong. And I'm not suggesting that you try and find the things wrong with the world. Leave curing malaria to somebody else. Look at the things you know well. Look at the problems you're having in your business flow. Look at the problems your customers are having. Look at the things you're bumping into every single day. And you'll see, ideas just appear. But I don't want you to take my word for it. And so I thought it might be helpful if I give you an example. And as an example, I'm going to use something that I did, something that I know well. It's a job that I had, and it's a job that I had 40 years ago when I was still in school. And I had a summer job, and I was a house painter. Now, this is 40 years ago. So back then, when we would drive to the hardware store to buy paint, we lived in a very different world. It certainly wasn't a self-driving car. I wasn't wearing a little computer on my wrist. I didn't have the Wi-Fi. I didn't have the internet, no streaming video. The innovation of that year, if I remember, was we finally had wireless remote control for the television, but still only had, I don't know, a dozen channels. But nevertheless, when you drove to the hardware store back then to buy paint, it used to come in a container that looks like this one. I know, primitive. I don't even remember them when they used to come like that. Anyway, we're going to fast forward about 40 years to this last summer, and I was charged with painting my daughter's bedroom. And once again, I had to drive to the hardware store to buy paint, and wow, do we live in a different world. I mean, now we do have the Wi-Fi, we do have the internet, we do have self-driving cars. I even have the Wi-Fi and the internet in my self-driving car. We carry little computers in our pocket. It is an amazingly transformed world. So it was really interesting to me that when I got to the hardware store and went in to buy the paint, that paint now comes in a container that looks like this one. 40 years. No change. Now, is this because we've determined that this is the ne plus ultra of paint delivery systems? I hope not, because anyone who's painted knows how flawed this thing is. I mean, to start, you've got to open the damn thing. But luckily for us, they have invented a very particular tool that you use to open a can of paint. Anybody? Screwdriver, of course. You know, luckily, we all keep screwdrivers in our house to open up our cans of Coke and our milk. So I do have a screwdriver. So I pry the lid carefully off, and now I have this lid covered in paint, which I've got to put newspaper down and carefully put it in the corner so I won't step on it. And now you have to stir the paint. And luckily, there's another specialized tool. It's called a stick. You can see it up here in the corner. You use that to stir the paint. And, you know, it actually works pretty well at stirring up the paint. But then you pull it out, you've got the stick covered with paint, which you've got to get the paint off the stick. And we've all learned this special technique where you put it in, you draw it out, scraping one side, and it works. The bottom's dry, but the top's still covered with paint. So what do? You flip it over and you stick it back in the can. You pull it back out, and now it's, wait a minute. Do this iteratively a few times, and you have a semi-dry stick, which you put in the corner with the lid, and don't step on it. And now you got to pour the paint. And you can see it has an easy pour spout. And it works okay on the way out. It all goes into my tray. The problem comes on the way back up. Because unless you're really careful, two things happen. First, paint dribbles down the side of the can, where it gets in your hands or your clothing or on the floor. But worse, a little bit of paint ends up filling up that little lip that the lid seals into. I'll come back to that in a minute. And I will not belabor the whole painting exercise, because most of us have done it, and you have rollers, and you can't quite tell where you've painted, and it's going on unevenly, and you have different colored trim, and you've got to put tape, and you need a razor blade for your windows, and then when it comes to cleaning up, you've got to pull this sodden roller off the handle, and it's a mess, and then you pour the empty can from the tray back in the can, but we're almost done. All that's left really now is to seal up the can, and it's perfect because it needs a screwdriver to open, so it needs a hammer to close it. So I put my lid carefully back on, and I give it a few good whacks with the hammer to seat the lid, but I'd forgotten about that paint that had filled up the lip, and it sprays out all over my legs and all over the floor and all over my freshly painted trim. Oh, wow. Now, as I told that story, I'm wondering whether anybody was thinking to themselves, that's silly. I don't know, why don't they sell paint in, like a milk carton? It pours out of a small spout, and it's got a lid that goes back up. Or even better, those things they use for detergent, where it sits on the counter, and it's got a little spigot. Or why isn't there maybe a magnetic stirrer in the bottom, or an aftermarket lid with a big spout? Or why isn't there, or why can't there be, or why don't I? Hopefully, at least some of you, as I was telling the story of the painting, had these ideas just popping into your head. And that was on a story about something that happened to me. Imagine what happens when you begin to apply that to problems that you're having. Because you see, ideas do not spring out of thin air in some mythical eureka moment. You have to look for ideas.